Am I on? Did y'all hear me? Good evening? Okay. I don't know if y'all are just being quiet or if the mic didn't come on. Matthew chapter 12. I was looking to see, was there any notes that I had left that I didn't finish? Yes, sir. Please do, because I just finished working out, so I'm sweating like Jacob Stevenson on a Sunday night at worship. And he's not even in here to hear that, is he? Oh, there he is. Okay, all right. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Uh-huh. Ooh, I don't know. I'd have to think about that. The question was looking from verse 24, really that section beginning around verse 20, where he's upbraiding the cities, Chorazin, Bethsaida. There's another one, right? Capernaum, yeah. That was went blank there for a second. It says it'll be more tolerable for the land of Sodom, for Tyre and Sidon in the day of judgment than for those cities. And then, as Tim pointed out, just in verse 25, he just kind of breaks into a prayer. I want to say there is another example of something at least similar. I don't know if it's that sharp a transition. I don't know. I don't want to. Sometimes I think of something and I'll give it one shot here, and if that's not right, I'll move on, because sometimes I'll derail myself looking for something. I guess, I don't know, you could say maybe an example in John 12, where he's saying, the hour is come, in verse 23, that the Son of Man should be glorified. He mentions, except a corn of wheat, or we would say a grain of wheat, fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone, but if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit. He that loves his life shall lose it. He that hates his life in this world shall keep it unto life eternal. If any man serve me, let him follow me. Where I am, there shall also my servant be. And if any man serve me, him will my Father honor. Now is my soul troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour, but for this cause came I into this hour. And then he just says, Father, glorify thy name. So kind of a prayer, I suppose. And then, there comes a voice from heaven that says, I both glorified it and will glorify it again. And Jesus goes on to point out, well, this voice didn't happen for my sake. It happened for your sake. To verify, so that you'll know. And in that context, he says, and I, if I be lifted up from the earth, will draw all men unto me. But yeah, it is interesting that, as you said, he's upbraiding these cities, and then he just begins this prayer. And I think it's kind of the similar idea there in John 12, similar idea as in John chapter 12, where it's kind of a prayer, but it's that context where he says, thank you, God, that you have hidden these things from the wise, the worldly prudent, and you've revealed them to babes. It says in the book of Acts, they look at Peter and John and they say what? Ignorant, unlearned men. And they're not saying that they just had no knowledge at all. It's kind of, they didn't go to our school, is sort of the idea. But they took knowledge of them that they had been with Jesus. So, he's kind of making a point here. Some of you so-called sophisticated people, some of you so-called wise people, you're some of the most foolish. And some of the ones that you would think of as just being kind of immature or babes, they're the ones who are the innocent, pure in heart, is the way Jesus mentions it in the Beatitudes. And they're going to receive the blessing. They're the ones who, by and large, obey. Is it acting out on us again? Oh, okay. Just a second. Oh, sorry. Got it? Thank you. Okay. But yeah, that's an interesting point. Right from this denunciation into a prayer. And that's where I was looking in my notes, because I think we covered, I felt like there was one more thing in my notes that I wanted to mention. Oh, I was just going to mention this, and it didn't really fit in necessarily with the invitation I was doing last week, but I did want to mention it because it goes with verses really 25 through 30, or 28 through 30 especially. But does this world not have enough pride and hubris? Jesus comes not, chest puffed out and with a lot of arrogance and pride or even pomp and circumstance, but he says, I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest unto your souls. The Son of Man came not looking to make a big show, not looking to put on a big show, but he came to do the work of the Father. And, from his birth to his death, nothing fancy as far as, a lot of show, but he is truly the bread of life. He is truly the light of the world. He is the living water. He is the Word, and so on. And he says, I am meek and lowly in heart. And if we're going to be like Jesus, well, we have to be meek and lowly in heart. All right, now let's go into chapter 12. Where did I put? Oh, you know what? I don't think I ever got my notes off the printer. I might need those. I've studied Matthew a lot, but I don't know that I'd want to just try to teach it without my notes. I'd certainly forget something. We might move quicker, though. Cover a lot more ground. All right, so do what? Matthew 12. Here's your chapter overview. This one is kind of, a lot of these I've done just basically using the ESV headings. This one I did kind of a conglomeration, some the way the ESV heading is, some the way the New King James. And all New King James, I don't think all of the New King James versions, editions, I guess would be the way to put it. I don't think all of them have headings. But I got one that I've been using for my daily Bible reading this year because I'm reading through the New King James, and it has headings. And sometimes I like theirs better than the ESV. Sometimes I just went with kind of a little bit of both and kind of my own paraphrase or whatever. Verses 1 through 8. This chapter has several sections, of course 50 verses, you would expect that. Verses 1 through 8, Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. 9 through 14, Jesus heals a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath. I was very tempted to combine these and just call verses 1 through 14, Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath, because that really is what is being established in both contexts. But there is a specific context to 9 through 14, so I think that is good on its own. 15 through 21, Jesus, God's chosen servant. 22 through 30, Jesus is accused of casting out demons by the prince of demons. 31 and 32 is blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. 33 through 37, a tree is known by its fruit. 38 through 42, the scribes and the Pharisees ask for a sign. 43 through 45 is the return of an unclean spirit. 46 through 50, Jesus' mother and brothers. They want to speak to him, and of course he's going to make the point that those who do the will of the Father are his mother, brothers, sisters, and so on. So Jesus, at that time, verse 1 begins, went out on the Sabbath day. They're going through the corn. This is one of those where, when the King James was translated, everybody understood it, but we read that and we think of, big tall ears of corn and a cornfield, especially, around here and in the Midwest, I suppose they would especially think of that. But I remember my uncle, he raised hogs for years, and so he was always growing huge fields of feed corn. And so you could just get lost in some of these fields. And he would often plant strategically in some of these fields. I guess he had to hide it because people would steal it. But sometimes way out in the middle of one of them would be a big patch of sweet corn. And that would be for him and Mom and all the other sisters. He was the only brother. He'd share all that with the sisters. And so you had to know which field to go to and where to go. But I remember messing around in the cornfields and having to go and pick corn and shuck corn and silk it and cut it and all that. It was not enough corn to get a combine or anything like that, at least for the sweet corn. He used that for the field corn. That's what we think of when we see this word corn. It's wheat is what it's talking about. They would understand that, and I don't know. Has anybody got your? Surely somebody's got a New King James, right? I don't have to look this up. What's it got? I think it says wheat, right? Verse 1. Grain. Yeah, there you go. Probably would be wheat. I suppose it could be barley, but some type of grain. Wheat and barley were the main ones. But we've talked about this before in I think it was in another context. The disciples, they're hungry. And so on another occasion in Mark chapter 6, Jesus is going to tell them, come aside into a deserted place by yourselves and rest a while. And Mark will make the comment by inspiration, there are many coming and going, and they had no leisure so much as to eat. We often talk about how busy Jesus was. Well, Jesus being busy often meant that, guess what? His disciples also were very busy. And sometimes they don't even have time to eat. So they're walking through a field, and they pluck the ears of corn. Again, we think corn, but the ears of grain. They pluck some grain, and you've seen the pictures of wheat growing in a field. And so they grab some of that, and they began to eat. Well, this, again, is kind of a truncated version that would make sense to a first century reader. It doesn't make as much sense to us because, well, I guess it would if you grew up on a wheat farm or some type of grain. But I've mentioned before that essentially what they're doing is they you see the wheat grow up, and at the top it's got the big head of wheat, and you take that and when in a situation where you're harvesting wheat, we talked about this. We talked about the Biblical History Center, some of the archaeology and geography and some of that from there. But you would bundle it together, it dries out, and then you thresh it, put it down on a threshing floor, run a threshing sledge over it. Sometimes an animal, sometimes usually you'd have an animal of some kind pulling that threshing sledge around and around the threshing floor, and sometimes a child even would sit on that or stand on it, and it's kind of, that puts weight on it, and all that breaks up and gets the seed out, and then you got to winnow it. You got to toss it up in the air. They would always build a threshing floor somewhere where the wind's blowing almost constantly. Toss that up in the air. The chaff just gets blown away by the wind, and that's an illustration that's often used in Scripture. And then you have the grain that falls back down. So now you've got your grain. Well, this is a very small scale version of that. Instead of using a threshing sledge, if you're just walking through a field and you got a little bit of grain there, it's like, I'm sure that peanut manufacturers that they're making peanut butter and the salted peanuts that you buy in the cans. I'm sure they've got machines that can just pop those things open, shell them, and I mean probably hundreds and thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, an hour. But if you're walking through a field or garden or whatever, maybe somebody's turned it under enough, and there's some peanuts that have been turned up from the ground. I do know peanuts grow underground, but maybe they're turned under or whatever, and you can see that, and you reach down. Well, you're not going to use a machine. You're going to use your hands, right, to open it up, like if you get some boiled peanuts at the gas station or something. But that's kind of what they're doing here, except they take the wheat and they just rub it in their hands, and that can get some of that chaff and just blow the chaff away, and now you've got it, and you can open up and get to the seed, the grain, and you can eat some. Probably not the best meal ever, but I suppose if you're hungry and haven't had time to eat, it might taste pretty good. The Pharisees see it, and they say, "Behold, thy disciples do that which is not lawful to do upon the Sabbath day." Well, are they upset because the disciples are stealing grain, right? It's not that. In fact, if somebody will just, we won't all turn there for time's sake, but just somebody, if you would, grab Deuteronomy 23, is it 25?
25 and 24, or just 25?
Go ahead and get 24 too, because that.
When thou comest to thy neighbor's vineyard, then thou mayest eat the grapes that thou field at thine own pleasure, but thou shalt not put any in the vessel. When thou comest into thy standing
All right, so the law of Moses allowed for if you're walking through and you're coming through somebody's field and there's some wheat growing and you're hungry and you want to grab some wheat, that's okay. There's one caveat, which is what?
Put it in a vessel or
You don't come with a sickle. Your neighbor comes out, hey, what's going on? You got this big, bundle of wheat. Oh, nothing, man. Hey, the law allows for this. That's not quite what it was intended for. But it's intended for just such a situation as this. Somebody comes through. He says, you got a vine of grapes. And somebody walks through, your neighbor walks through your vineyard, and maybe he's hungry, and, he grabs a few grapes. Used to be a man in my grandmother's community. That man would have a fit if you came by and grabbed even a grape off his vine. He had these, I think they were, I don't know how you say it, scuppernong? Is that how you say it? I didn't even think they were that good. I mean, not that I ever got any, but that dude would have a fit if you just even tried to grab a single grape. Man, he would just go off. But, the law of Moses allowed for this under the old covenant. Somebody's walking through and you're hungry, just grab a few grapes. But now if you start, you whip out your bushel basket and you start picking all the grapes, then yeah, that's a problem. So that's not why they're upset, of course. And the text bears that out because they say your disciples are doing what's not lawful to do on the Sabbath day. Now, here's where it gets, sometimes people really misunderstand this. So he replies, Jesus does, 2 illustrations. One deals with David in the showbread. One deals with priests on the Sabbath. He says, have you not read what David did when he was an hungered, or hungry we would say, and they that were with him? How he entered into the house of God and did eat the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, neither for them which were with him, but only for the priests. Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath days the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? Well, let's just stop there and talk about these 2 questions or illustrations that he uses. Understand here, this is, it blows my mind. Sometimes I hear people teach this. I don't know if I'd say I've heard a gospel preacher teach it this way. I'm trying to think if I have. I don't recall, but I've heard others act like that what this is here is Jesus is saying essentially there are situations where it's okay just to break the law. We would call that what? Situation ethics. Yeah, we should call it sin, yeah. Situation ethics is kind of the, sometimes we come up with these fancy words for, something that really is just that plain sin. But Jesus is not teaching situation ethics. First of all, what they're upset about is not, obviously, as we pointed out, not that they're picking grain. What are they upset about? They're upset because this is done on the Sabbath day. Why would that upset them? No work on the Sabbath. And you sure don't go out and reap a field. Okay. I would have a hard time in any court making the case that what they've done here is reaping a field. And that's part of what Jesus is pointing out here. You're not really concerned about, we're just so upset. You have violated the pure and righteous law of God. They're fault finding. And that's what Jesus is going to call them out on. They're saying you are reaping on the Sabbath. This could hardly be considered as reaping. What it was is it's a violation of their tradition. The Pharisees were professionals at binding things God had never bound. And incidentally, sometimes they would loose things that God never loosed, as we'll see when we get to Matthew 15. They bind this tradition about hand washing. They bind this tradition that you can't even pluck some grain on the Sabbath as you walk through a field and are hungry, doing the Lord's work, no less. And yet they would loose over here where you're supposed to take care of your aging parents. Oh, well, I've promised a gift to the temple, and so I'm sorry, Mom, sorry, Dad, can't help you out. Well, that was a complete violation of the law, but they just kind of ignored that. Go ahead, Tim.
Something that is important, Jesus is going to address this later on in understanding about the Sabbath. Jesus says on one occasion, the Sabbath was made for man, not man
Yeah.
So that's key to remember when you're considering Sabbath.
And so what he says here with David is, he says, well, have you read this about David? Do you notice what he says about what David did? What does he say? It was not lawful. He didn't say it was okay. He said what David did was wrong. Even though David was in dire straits, was he not? When that happened, what was the situation? He's fleeing from Saul. So, life or death situation. Jesus doesn't justify it. But here's his point. You revere David. You hold David in such high esteem. You just overlook this transgression, which was in fact a transgression. Over here are my disciples. And they do something that leaves them, what's the last word of verse 5? They're blameless in this matter. And yet you are sitting here trying to accuse them. They have not done anything wrong. You'll justify David over here, or attempt to, who did do wrong. You wrongfully condemn the blameless in this situation. He's pointing out their hypocrisy. He says, I know exactly what you're doing here. You're trying to find fault. Yes, sir?
That was what I was going to point out, is Jesus has a significant advantage here because he knows their thoughts.
Yes.
And he knows what they're driving at.
Yeah, he knows exactly why they're saying what they're saying, and that's a distinct advantage. And he says, I know exactly what you're doing here. You're trying to find fault. You justify and defend David, who did do wrong, but you condemn the guiltless disciples here in this circumstance. There's a verse in Proverbs 26, verse 7 that says, the legs of the lame are not equal. And that's kind of the situation here with the Pharisees. They got, the one leg over here where they try to justify David, who was in the wrong. The other leg over here where they're trying to condemn the guiltless or the blameless. And the legs of the lame are just not equal. Then he uses the example of the priest working on the Sabbath. Well, listen. The law says no work to be done on the Sabbath. But guess what? If you're a priest, you know what one of your busiest work days is? It's the Sabbath. It's kind of like sometimes it's obviously a different scenario, different covenant, but sometimes I tell people, I had a church one time, an elder who told me, and he was, I love him, respect him, and I'm not trying to be ugly, but I kind of laughed when he said this to me. But I was working with them, and they were working out, what days you're going to work, office hours, or whatever, and so I said, well, do I get off days? And he says, I said, well, I know I get Saturday, but I said, so is Saturday the only off day? And he said, no, Sunday. And I said, are you serious? I said, do you know that's the busiest day of work for a preacher? And so, it's that's why the priests were. Especially a lot of the feasts, one of the main days was the Sabbath. And of course, every Sabbath they had some responsibility within the temple, within the tabernacle before they had the temple. So, but that's what they did. They're serving God, and they're preparing and getting everything so that others can come and worship, and everything's in order. The lamps are lit, and the sacrifices are ready, and all that. Nobody accused the priest of breaking the Sabbath. Those Pharisees wouldn't dare have accused the priest of breaking the Sabbath. They knew. That's what the law called for. If you're from Levi, you're going to be serving as a priest, from the tribe of Levi. You're going to be serving as a priest, and that's what you're going to be doing. And so they acknowledged, the Pharisees did, that some activity was allowed. Tim mentioned on another occasion, Jesus is going to say the Sabbath was not made for man, or man was not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath was made for man. And that's kind of the idea. It's not meant to be some kind of restricted binding thing. It's meant because God knows we need a break. We need rest. It's not healthy just to work nonstop and go nonstop, but we also need to sometimes be still and know that He is God. And we need a break in that sense. But He's not saying that there's nothing at all whatsoever that anybody can do. And that's the point that He's making here. And so He points out their hypocrisy with David, and He points out that you yourselves acknowledge that it doesn't rule out all work altogether, all activity altogether. They haven't reaped. They're not harvesting a field. But He says, you're condemning the guiltless. You're condemning the blameless. I said verse 5. I meant to say verse 7 a while ago. He's mentioning the verse 5, still talking about the priest. And when he says in the temple they profane the Sabbath, he's using that word as, basically he's kind of like saying, according to your definition of breaking the Sabbath, they profane the Sabbath, every Sabbath. So what about that? Well, obviously they got no answer, because what can they say? And then he says, of course, I say to you that in this place is one greater than the temple. And then he's going to quote from Hosea 6, verse 6. Is it 6:6? Yes. As he did in Matthew 9:13, it says, if you had known what this means, I'll have mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. That's interesting to me, because the one greater than the temple here, of course, is Jesus. And he says it's like priests who are serving on the Sabbath. They're doing God's service. They're serving God, who rules the Sabbath. And Jesus' disciples, guess what? By serving him, and they were so busy they didn't even have a chance to eat, and now they're hungry, and they're just grabbing a few heads of grain as they pass through. Guess who they're serving? God. This is a subtle, it's not one of the more overt claims, but this is a subtle claim that he's God in the flesh. And so he makes that point. And then he's not only illustrating that the disciples had done no wrong, but being God in the flesh, he teaches here his lordship over the Sabbath itself. And by the way, sometimes people get mixed up here as well, and they say, well, that's what Jesus says, that, have mercy and not sacrifice. So what Jesus is saying here is don't sweat the small stuff. Don't sweat the details. That's not what he's saying at all. What he's saying is, you teach, even the most meticulous law keeping, but you divorce that from a pure heart that wants to serve God faithfully because he is God, and it means nothing. Even if one of us should keep the law down to the letter, if we do that with the wrong attitude, well, we've violated the law in that sense, if nothing else. But he says you can't divorce law keeping from a right attitude. We've talked about that before. John 4:24. God is a spirit. They that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. Does God want us to worship in spirit, or does God want us to worship in truth? The answer is yes. It is both. It's not either or. He desires and demands both. Here, these people were fault finders. They were hypocrites. Their attitudes were just sinfully rotten. And I love what he says in verse 8. For the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath day. It's almost like he's sort of summing up what he says by, okay, you hypocrites justify David, who did wrong. You try to condemn my disciples who did no wrong. You conveniently forget that the priests do activity every Sabbath day. And oh, by the way, not that I need to justify myself to you all anyways, because I am Lord of the Sabbath. And he's pointing out, again, it's a subtle claim to deity. I'm God in the flesh. I am Lord, and the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. And so I looked at again today, and I still think that's kind of what he's saying here. In summation, I don't need to, here are the reasons why what they did is not wrong. But oh, by the way, I don't really need to justify myself to you anyways. Even if I told them to go out and reap that entire field, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Now, he wouldn't do that because he lived and died perfectly according to the law of Moses. But he's making that point as if to say, hey, I don't really owe you an explanation, but because I am meek and lowly in heart, I'm giving you one. I think that's a pretty powerful closing to this little section. You were going to say something, Tim?
To put all that to neat, the parallel to exactly this point is Mark 2:24 through 28.
Yeah, and I meant to mention that.
And that encapsulates, that's where he says, man, Sabbath was made for man. And then he follows that up the next verse and says, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath.
Yeah.
So yes.
and thank you, because I totally forgot to mention that. Parallel passages in Mark 2, 24 or 23 through 28, if you want to expand it a little bit. Luke 6, 1 through 5 also. But yeah, I love that the way he, and again, you see the meekness, the humility of Jesus, because he says, I'll give you an explanation, although I really don't owe you one. All right, let's go to 9 through 14. Here Jesus heals a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath. Jesus, and I missed that. I was going to mention that early in this section too. This is kind of a recurring theme in Jesus' ministry. Conflict with the religious leaders over something that happens on the Sabbath day. Sometimes it's healing, sometimes it's casting out a demon, but happening on the Sabbath day, or disciples plucking grain. I had a preacher tell me one time, an older preacher, and I think there might have been something to it. He said, sometimes I wonder if Jesus didn't intentionally wait to heal on the Sabbath just so he could, not just trying to aggravate and stir up, but to make a point, because they had such a misunderstanding. And I don't even know if it was a misunderstanding, at least among those religious leaders, as much as it was just hypocrisy. They had their own little laws that they wanted to bind on people, didn't care about what the law said. This is what we say. You don't question this. So here, by the way, you got a parallel here as well. Mark 3, 1 through 6, Luke 6, 6 through 11. And so Luke's account, by the way, tells us this was a different Sabbath. This is not the same Sabbath as verses 1 through 8, which is another reason why I thought it'd be better to separate these two sections. That's from Luke 6, verse 6. There's nothing wrong with the question that they ask here. They ask a question in verse 10. He's departed thence, he went to their synagogue. Behold, there was a man which had his hand withered. And they asked him, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath days? That they might accuse him. That's why they did this. It's not an honest question. Had they asked it honestly, there's nothing wrong with that question. But of course, they didn't ask it from an honest heart. I was looking to see. Sometimes I study ahead, and I think I'm thinking of what's happening later on in the chapter. Is this it? All right, I'm in 9. They asked the question, and Jesus is going to respond, so I must be thinking of later on in the chapter. There's a spot later on in the chapter where it's going to say he knew their thoughts. But this 25, okay. Yeah, I was thinking that was further down because I kept looking. Oh, yeah, 25, okay. I was looking for it later on, and I just looked right over that verse. Okay. Sometimes, like I said, I study on ahead, and it starts all running together. So they asked the question, which again, in and of itself is not a bad question, but they're asking it from an impure motive. So he answers, and he has 2 questions. Now, in Mark's account, we get one of these questions, and we get the other in Matthew's account. Mark 3:4 gives the first question. Jesus, of course, did this, I don't know if I'd say all the time, but he did it. It was not infrequent, put it that way, to answer a question with a question, right? First question he says is, Mark 3:4, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? That's your first question. And depending on how you've got punctuation there, I think in the King James it's 2 or 3 questions, but the way the New King James has it, it's just 1 question there. But really, even if you got the punctuation with 2 or 3 questions, it's the same idea. And then the second one is here, what man shall there be among you that shall have 1 sheep, and if it fall into a pit on the Sabbath day, will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? He said, there is not a one of you that if a lamb falls into a pit, that you go, oh man, I'm so sorry to lose that little lamb, Sabbath day. What you gonna do? They don't do that. What do? They go get him. They go get the lamb out. That's just what they do. Yeah, they understood that's not a violation of the Sabbath. And buddy, sometimes people will say, it drives me crazy. It grinds my gears to hear people say, I don't believe Jesus was the Son of God. I think he was a good man and had some good teachings. And sure, a lot of them are good. They would do the world well to follow him. But he's not the Son of God. Oh, no, 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 no. This man is either the Son of God, he is a horrible, horrible person who is a filthy liar. That would be option 2. Or option 3, bless his heart, he's insane. Because he thinks he is the Son of God when poor guy's just another person. But he ain't a good man if he's not who he claimed to be. That would be a liar. The only other option would be to say he's crazy. But, one of the things that we point out is he definitely wasn't crazy. Because here's an example. The logic he uses is just, over and over again in his ministry, it's flawless. So here's the logic that he's presenting. Those Jews, those Pharisees, they would admit it was acceptable to rescue a sheep who had fallen into a pit on the Sabbath day. They would admit that. A human being is of far more value than a sheep. Thus, the only logical conclusion is it is perfectly acceptable to help a person, to heal a person on the Sabbath day. And that's what he says. Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. By the way, Mark's account also tells us this was an occasion when Jesus, he worked a miracle, but what's his mood when he works this miracle? Mark 3:5 tells us, he looked on them with anger, being grieved for the hardness of their hearts. He was angry. And so, as we often point out, it's not a sin to be angry. Even Paul says in Ephesians 4, be ye angry and sin not. But Jesus was angry on this occasion for the hardness, grieved for the hardness of their hearts. The Pharisees' reaction at the miracle, instead of faith, what do? Verse 14. They went out and held a council against him, how they might destroy him. Isn't that interesting? By the way, this is probably somewhere in the second full year of Jesus' ministry. This shows you just how long they wanted to kill him. They were just trying to find that right opportunity. I know. And you sit here and you see a miracle, you think, oh, that'll convince. What did the rich man say from Hades? Oh, send Lazarus.
You'll send somebody back to my brothers.
Yeah. And of course, Abraham says, well, they got Moses and the prophets. They got scriptures. And what does he say? Oh, no. What? Let them see a genuine miracle. Somebody rises from the dead, and they'll believe. And what was the response? If they won't believe Moses, if they won't believe the scriptures, they won't believe even if somebody rose from the dead. Sometimes people say, sometimes people that are dyed-in-the-wool atheists, and they say, sometimes the question is asked to an atheist, well, what would it take? Is there anything that would convince you there is a God, that God is real? Yes, if I saw a real, undeniable miracle. Well, they saw one right here. And a little bit later in the chapter, they're going to see one, and they're even going to take it a step further and say what? Oh, sure. It's an undeniable miracle, but he's doing miracles by the power of Satan. It's unbelievable. So sometimes people are just determined not to believe. So there were other occasions, by the way, that they wanted to kill Jesus. Luke 4:16-31, he starts mentioning about Gentiles and how Elijah went to the widow. Well, there were a lot of widows in Israel, but Elijah sent to a Gentile widow. Well, there were a lot of lepers in the days of Elisha, but who was healed? Naaman. And what was Naaman? What nationality? He wasn't Israelite, he was Syrian. And now, man, they're ready to kill him. They were so prejudiced. John 5:17 and 18 and John 8:58 and 59 were two other occasions. On both of those, he clearly lays claim, I am God in the flesh. And they want to kill him. They'd seen the miracles. It's not like they didn't have the evidence. Verses 15 through 21. I think we can just summarize this section real quick. So they hold a council how they might destroy him. Jesus knew it. He withdrew himself from thence. Great multitudes followed him, and he healed them all. Great multitudes would follow Jesus on various occasions because of his miracles. Sometimes it was because of his teaching. Sometimes it's both. Sometimes it's because they got to eat food, as in John chapter 6. Sometimes because they wanted to follow him and serve God and be disciples. Matthew records that, at least in this instance, he healed them all. Here, like on some other occasions, Jesus tells them not to make him known, verse 16. And Matthew says this is a fulfillment of Isaiah 42, 1 through 4. He doesn't tell us it's Isaiah 42, 1 through 4, because it wasn't Isaiah 42, 1 through 4 to him. It was just Isaiah. They didn't have the chapter and verse divisions that we have. They would just reference Isaiah, of course. But that's how it is in our English Bibles. Isaiah 42, 1 through 4, the meek and humble Messiah. And here again, you see Matthew carrying out his chief purpose in writing the book, which is what? Jesus is your promised Messiah. He's writing, of course, primarily to Jews, not only to Jews, but primarily to Jews. And he's saying, Jesus is your Messiah. Verse 19 has a specific application to this instance here. He shall not strive nor cry, neither shall any man hear his voice in the streets. Did anybody ever hear Jesus' voice in the streets? You going to tell me nobody ever heard his voice in the streets? Well, sure. It's not meaning never hear him at all. And it's not a contradiction. What it's talking about here is that in this specific context, he's not going to strive. Those Pharisees, they kind of wanted to fight. They kind of wanted an argument. Jesus withdrew from the antagonistic Pharisees. He didn't just stand up and say, oh, I'd like to see you try. You think you could destroy me? I'm God in the flesh. Go for it. No, he withdrew because he's not striving. And the voice in the streets reference is where Jesus would often tell people, don't make it known. Don't tell anybody. Keep it quiet. Again, he's not seeking a big parade to honor and glorify himself. And that's the idea there. The victory of verse 20 is not some kind of carnal military victory, of course. It's victory in Jesus. Paul says in Romans 8:37, the King James says we are more than conquerors. Does anybody remember the way it's a singular Greek word, but if you remember the Greek word or how we sort of paraphrase that, does anybody remember it? More than conquerors. There's a popular brand that gets their name from the root word. It's a big sports brand. Somebody just do it. Give me the answer. Nike, there you go. Nikao, Nike. And so what he says in Romans 8:37, Paul says we are Hooper Nikao. And what does that mean? Hyper conquerors in Jesus Christ. More than conquerors. I like kind of a literal translation there. I think it's kind of a little bit of a made-up word, but it gets the idea across, doesn't it? Hyper conquerors. And then, of course, in 1 Corinthians 15:57, thanks be unto God, which giveth us the victory through Jesus Christ. And in that context is victory over sin and victory over death. That's the resurrection chapter. So Matthew shows here again, his chief purpose in writing is to present Jesus as the prophesied Messiah. But it's not just to the Jews. Again, remember, because verse 21, if you look at verse 21 here, in his name shall whom trust? The Gentiles. Jesus came to save Jews, Gentiles, rich, poor, black, white, whomever. He came to save all of humanity. We'll stop there and pick up at verse 22. Next time won't be next week because our gospel meeting will be next week. In 2 weeks we'll pick up, talk about Jesus accused of casting out demons by the power of Satan. And then we'll talk about, everybody wants to ask the question, what is the blasphemy against the Holy Spirit? You'll get all the answers next week. I don't know about in 2 weeks. Sydney will have all the answers next week. Thank y'all very much.